In the autumn of 1872, nearly 30 years after its violent end, a land surveyor named Thomas Fry was hired to map the desolate swamps of coastal South Carolina. His employers warned him to stay clear of the Central Marsh, a place the locals still refused to go. They called it Vance Hollow. Driven by curiosity and the promise of a shortcut, Fry ignored the warnings. He pushed through cypress trees dripping with moss until he found it, the skeletal ruins of a great house, consumed by rot and shadow. The air was thick with a silence that felt heavy, unnatural. Near the foundation, he found a massive, charred oak tree. Embedded in its blackened bark were dozens of rusted iron rings and segments of chain. It was, unmistakably, a punishment tree. But it was what he found in the collapsed cellar that truly marked his soul. Beneath a rotted trapdoor, he uncovered a small, dry chamber. Inside, two objects lay side by side. A heavy leather-bound ledger, its pages filled with meticulous handwritten entries detailing brutal punishments, and a locked mahogany chest. When he forced the lock, he found it packed not with silver or coin, but with delicate silk gowns, Venetian masks, and vials of exotic, cloying perfume. Fry had stumbled upon the heart of a mystery band from local memory. He had found the disturbing duality that defined the life and the horrifying disappearance of Elara Vance. The legend of Vance Hollow began in 1841. The plantation was already old, a decaying rice empire built on mud and misery, left to a distant relative in Charleston. That relative was Alara Vance, a woman of 23, recently widowed and possessing a startling porcelain beauty. When she arrived to take possession, the local gentry were prepared to pity her. They found, instead, a woman of chilling intelligence and unnerving self-possession. She was a phantom in white linen, gliding across her property with an auditor's cold gaze. She dismissed the aging overseer and took personal command of the plantation's operation. In the daylight, she was the very image of Southern piety and rigid discipline. She attended church, spoke in measured, polite tones, and demanded absolute, uncompromising order. But that order was maintained by a system of terror that quickly became infamous. Alara Vance, it was said, did not tolerate mistakes. A dropped cup, a me-swept step, a hesitant glance, all were met with punishments of shocking severity. The screams from the whipping post became a regular, horrifying rhythm in the suffocating heat. But it was the night that birthed the darkest whispers. As soon as the sun dipped below the cypress line, the rules of Vance Hollow seemed to invert. The main house, so silent and rigid by day, would come alive. Travelers on the distant coastal road reported seeing the windows of the Vance mansion ablaze with light at hours when all decent folk were asleep. They spoke of strange, melodic music, unfamiliar and unsettling, drifting across the water. The slaves on neighboring properties whispered about the summons. On any given night, Elara Vance would call for specific slaves to be brought to the main house. They were always the young, the strong, or the beautiful. They would be taken from the quarters, bathed and dressed in fine livery or silks, garments kept locked away during the day. They would enter the main house and not emerge until dawn. When they returned, they were changed. They were silent, their eyes haunted, carrying a knowledge that isolated them from the others. Some returned with a strange new arrogance, a dark favor in their eyes. Others returned broken, their minds seemingly fractured, and were never seen in the fields again. This macabre duality, the iron-fisted, pious mistress of the day and the decadent, mysterious queen of the night, created an atmosphere of profound psychological terror. No one understood the rules. No one knew what was expected. Was it better to be punished by her hand in the sun, or chosen by her in the dark? Two figures came to define the internal politics of Vance Hollow. The first was Silas, the head house slave. He was an older man, cunning and cruel, who had served the Vance family for decades. He was Alara's daytime enforcer, the one who interpreted her cold glances and carried out her brutal sentences at the punishment tree. He relished his power, the fear he inspired. Silas was the gatekeeper. He managed the house, and he managed the roster of those summoned for the night's duties. He alone seemed to understand the mistress's horrifying appetites. The second figure was his opposite, a young field hand named Cyrus. He was strong, defiant, and possessed a simmering rage that should have seen him broken or sold within a week of Alara's arrival. Yet he endured. Alara seemed fascinated by his unbroken spirit. She would watch him from her window as he worked, a strange, calculating intensity in her gaze. Cyrus was punished often, more severely than any aunt. Her for his insolence. But unlike the others, the punishments never seemed to break him. They only seemed to forge him into something harder, more dangerous. A tension, thick and poisonous, grew between Silas, the symbol of established control, and Cyrus, the symbol of defiant chaos. It was a tension Alara seemed to cultivate, a dreadful game only she understood. The local community, the other plantation owners of the district, kept their distance. They were made uncomfortable by Elara Vance. She was a woman operating without a husband or a male overseer, a breach of social structure. The rumors of her daytime cruelty were dismissed as the necessary, if unladylike, management of a difficult property. But the whispers of her nights, those were more troubling. They hinted at a decadence that was not just immoral but dangerous. It threatened the very foundation of their rigid, power-obsessed society. But Alara was wealthy, and her plantation was isolated, buffered by miles of impassable swamp. She attended church, donated to the parish, and her rice yields were bafflingly among the highest in the region. So society looked away. They chose not to see the strange, expensive deliveries that arrived for her by boat. Crates of wine, bolts of silk, strange musical instruments, and texts from New Orleans and the Caribbean that were most certainly not religious tracts. They chose to ignore the fact that while Alara Vance bought new slaves at auction with alarming frequency, she never sold any. Her property was a black hole. People went in, but they never, ever came out. The mystery of Vance Hollow was sealed by a conspiracy of polite silence. It was Reverend Blythe, the new parish clergyman, who finally dared to question the darkness at Vance Hollow. Blythe was a devout man from Boston, idealistic and utterly unprepared for the casual horrors of his new posting. His concern began not with Alara, but with a soul he tried to save. A neighboring planter, Mr. Rowe, had purchased a slave from Alara Vance in a rare private transaction. Rowe had sought Blythe's counsel because the man, once a productive worker, was now useless. He was mute, gripped by a permanent, shaking terror. He refused to sleep indoors. Most disturbing of all, the man was terrified of two things in equal measure: the sight of a whip and the scent of perfume. Blythe was horrified. This was not the result of a simple breaking. This was the work of a shattered mind, a soul that had been methodically dismantled. When he learned the man had come from Vance Hollow and had been one of those summoned to the main house, Blythe felt a cold, righteous dread. He knew he could not stay silent. He announced his intention to pay a pastoral visit to the reclusive Mrs. Vance, a decision the local gentry strongly advised against. Reverend Blythe's first visit to Vance Hollow in the spring of 1842 was an exercise in controlled illusion. He was met at the gate by Silas, the house manager, who regarded him with a polite contempt that was deeply unsettling. Silas led him to the main house, a grand but decaying structure that seemed to be suffocating under the weight of Spanish moss. The air itself felt heavy, unnaturally still. Alara Vance received him in a parlor that was meticulously clean, yet austere and cold. She was, as rumors suggested, breathtakingly beautiful, dressed in a simple, high-collared white dress. She spoke with intellect and precision, quoting scripture and discussing parish matters with a calm piety. But as she spoke, Blythe felt a chilling disconnect. Her eyes, a pale, piercing blue, held no warmth. They were the eyes of a biologist studying an insect. She offered him tea, and as she poured, he noticed the absolute terror of the young house slave who served them. The girl's hands trembled so violently that the cup rattled in its saucer. Elara never raised her voice. She simply paused, her gaze fixed on the girl, until the rattling stopped. The silence that fell was louder than any scream Blythe had ever heard. He realized in that moment that he was in the presence of a truly forbidden power. Blythe, steeling himself, inquired about the spiritual welfare of her people. He mentioned the man sold to Mr. Rowe and the troubling state of his soul. Alara's expression did not change. She simply tilted her head. "The Reverend must understand," she said, her voice like chilled glass, "that not all souls are destined for salvation. Some are flawed vessels. I pride myself on finding a use for even the most broken things. It is a work of charity, you see." Her words were a perfect deflection, a horrifying blend of piety and absolute perversion. As he pressed gently about her methods, she smiled. "We are a place of rigid routine, Reverend. Discipline is the handmaiden of faith. Perhaps you would care to see my chapel." She led him to a small, whitewashed building on the edge of the property. It was clean, orderly, and filled with pews. But as they stood in the aisle, Blythe noticed something. The air was thick with the same cloying, exotic scent he had noticed on the disturbed slave. It was a scent of jasmine and musk, a perfume of the senses, not the soul. He also saw, half hidden behind the altar, a small, dark stain on the floorboards. It looked disturbingly like old wine or something worse. As Alara spoke of prayer and redemption, Reverend Blythe felt a wave of nausea. He realized the chapel was part of the performance. The sounds, the smells. This place was not for worship. It was for something else. A desecration. He made his excuses, his pastoral duty dissolving into a desperate need to escape. As Silas escorted him back to the main drive, Blythe caught a glimpse of movement on the second-floor balcony of the main house. A figure stood in the shadow, watching him. It was not Alara, it was a man. He was tall, dressed not in field clothes but in a tailored waistcoat. For a moment the man stepped into a shaft of sunlight. It was Cyrus, the defiant field hand. He was no longer defiant. His face was a mask of cold arrogance, his eyes holding the same chilling emptiness as his mistress. He was watching Blythe not as a slave, but as a host might watch an unwelcome guest depart. Blythe fled Vance Hollow, his mind reeling. The duality was a lie. The day and night were not separate, they were one. The daytime punishments were the forge, and the nighttime rituals were the fire, and Alara Vance was creating something. Over the next few months, Reverend Blythe became obsessed. He began a quiet, dangerous investigation, chronicling his findings in a private journal. He sought out the carpenters and artisans who had worked at Vance Hollow upon Alara's arrival. One man, a carpenter from Charleston, finally spoke, his voice hushed with fear. He described being hired for an unusual job. He was to construct a forbidden wing in the main house. The work was bizarre. He was ordered to soundproof the walls with layers of cork and wool. He installed heavy oak doors with complex locks, locks that could only be operated from the inside. He built small, barred windows that faced not the grounds, but a solid brick wall. Most disturbing of all, he was tasked with reinforcing the floorboards in the central room, as if to support an immense, localized weight. He was paid triple his usual fee in gold and told that if he ever spoke of what he had built, the swamp would claim him. Blythe now understood. The music, the scents, the summons. It all happened within a fortified, soundproof bunker, a secret kingdom hidden within the house itself. Blythe's journal entries grew more frantic. He began to see Elara Vance not as a mere sadist, but as a high priestess of some dark, personal cult. He learned of her past. She was from a disgraced New Orleans family, rumored to have mixed their French aristocracy with forbidden Vodun practices from the Caribbean. She had not been widowed. Her husband had died in a mysterious fire, a fire from which she had escaped without a single burn. She had been exiled to the remote Carolina plantation as an embarrassment. She had not arrived as a victim, she had arrived as a queen taking her throne. This, Blythe theorized, was her true macabre purpose. The daytime punishments were a performance of control, a way to satisfy the prying eyes of the outside world. But they were also a selection process. She was testing her subjects, weeding out the weak, searching for those with a specific capacity. She wasn't just breaking them, she was evaluating them. Those who broke were discarded, but those who endured, those who, like Cyrus, met her gaze, they were chosen. They were elevated from the hell of the day to the inner sanctum of her night. The transformation of Cyrus was now complete. He was no longer seen in the fields. He was Alara's constant companion, her shadow. He dressed in the fine clothes of a gentleman, rode her best horse, and oversaw the plantation's finances. He spoke with an educated, measured tone that he had clearly learned from her. This was the ultimate transgression, a social atom bomb in the 1840s South. It was a power shift that was terrifying to behold. But it was Silas, the old guard enforcer, who suffered the most. He had been supplanted. His power, derived from Alara's daytime terror, was now meaningless. The new power, the true power, was Cyrus, the king of her forbidden wing. Silas was relegated to mundane tasks, his face a mask of simmering, impotent rage. He was a man who had built his identity on being the favored instrument of a cruel master, only to find himself replaced by the very thing he had been tasked to destroy. Blythe wrote in his journal, "The balance of evil has shifted. The creature has surpassed the creator. I fear for what comes next, for the old serpent, scorned, is the most poisonous of all." The autumn of 1842 was thick with tension. The crops were harvested, but the atmosphere at Vance Hollow had turned sour, paranoid. Elara Vance and Cyrus were rarely seen outside the main house. They had become prisoners of their own dark paradise, sealed within the soundproofed wing. The daytime punishments, once a regular rhythm, had all but ceased. They were no longer needed. The psychological terror was now total, absolute. The remaining slaves moved like ghosts, their will completely eroded, trapped between the fading power of a bitter Silas and the rising, unpredictable power of Cyrus. Then Silas did the unthinkable. In a desperate, drunken bid to reclaim his status, he rode to the nearest town and sought out the sheriff. He began to talk. He spoke of the forbidden wing, of the sounds, of the rituals that took place. He spoke of a mistress who was not a mistress and a slave who was now a master. The sheriff, a man who believed in the simple, brutal order of things, found the story too insane, too perverse to be credible. He dismissed Silas as a drunk and a liar, beating him and sending him back to his mistress. But the words had been spoken. The secret was out. When Silas returned to Vance Hollow, battered and humiliated, he must have known his fate was sealed. He had broken the one unforgivable rule: silence. What happened next is a matter of horrifying speculation, pieced together from Blythe's terrified theories and the evidence later found in the ruins. The power dynamic, so carefully balanced by Alara, had shattered. She and Cyrus were now exposed. Their secret world, built on a foundation of absolute control, was threatened. Silas, the old servant, the loyal enforcer, had become the single greatest liability. He knew where the mundane cruelty of the day ended and the macabre theater of the night began. He knew every secret, every participant, every depravity. He had to be silenced, not with a simple punishment but with an absolute and final erasure. But who would be the one to act? The mistress who had built the system, or the man she had anointed as its king? Or perhaps, in their strange, forbidden union, they had become something else entirely. A single entity, acting with one mind. On the night of October 31st, 1842, a fearsome coastal storm swept through the region. Wind and rain lashed the swamps, turning the world into a churning chaos of noise and water. It was the perfect cover. A traveler, his carriage broken on the coastal road, reported seeing a volcano in the swamp. Vance Hollow was on fire. It was not a normal fire, not a simple blaze spreading from one building to the next. The traveler swore that the main house, the slave quarters, the chapel, and the barns had all erupted in flames at the exact same time. It was an organized, systematic inferno. The flames, fanned by the storm, were so bright they lit the sky for miles, a horrifying, macabre beacon in the heart of the marsh. The intensity of the heat was so great that the cypress trees at the water's edge were scorched, and the swamp itself seemed to boil. By dawn, as the storm passed, nothing remained of Vance Hollow but smoking, blackened foundations and the smell of sulfur. The reign of Alara Vance was over. Days later, when the ground was cool enough to walk on, the sheriff and a small posse rode out to investigate. The scene was one of total annihilation. The main house had collapsed into its own cellar. The slave quarters were gone. Even the massive punishment tree was a charred, skeletal husk. They began the grim work of searching for survivors. They found none. In the ruins of the quarters, they found the charred remains of nearly 30 men, women, and children, killed in their sleep by the smoke and flames. It was a massacre. The official theory quickly formed, a massive, coordinated slave revolt. The slaves, it was assumed, had set the fires, barricaded themselves in their quarters in a final, defiant act and been consumed by their own terrible vengeance. Or perhaps they had fled into the swamp and been taken by the storm. It was a neat, simple story. It closed the book on the troubling rumors of Vance Hollow, but it was a lie. The posse found one other body. Not in the quarters, but in the ruins of the main house. The body was found near the entrance to the chapel. It was Silas, the house manager, but he had not died in the fire. The coroner's report was brief and brutal. Silas had been killed before the inferno began. His throat had been cut from ear to ear, a wound of profound violence and rage. But of Alara Vance, the mistress of the house, and of Cyrus, her shadow king, there was no trace. No bones, no fragments, no sign that they had been in the house at all. It was as if they had simply evaporated, taken by the flames or by the storm. The sheriff, content with his slave revolt theory, ruled that Alara and Cyrus had likely been the first victims, their bodies consumed entirely by the unnatural heat of the blaze, or perhaps dragged into the swamp and murdered before the fire was set. His case was closed. Vance Hollow was abandoned, its lands forfeited to the state and left to be reclaimed by the swamp. The polite society of South Carolina breathed a collective sigh of relief, eager to bury the disturbing, forbidden memory of Elara Vance and her macabre kingdom. But Reverend Blythe never accepted the official story. In the final, frantic entries of his private journal, he outlined a different, far more chilling theory. He did not believe it was a slave revolt. The slaves of Vance Hollow were too broken, too psychologically controlled. He believed the fire was an escape, a calculated, brilliant, and horrifying escape. He theorized that Alara and Cyrus had acted together. When Silas returned from town, having confessed their secrets to the sheriff, they knew their world was over. He had to be silenced. Blythe pictured the scene, a joint execution, the old guard dispatched by the new, a ritualistic killing to seal their dark pact. Then, with the storm as their cover, they enacted their final plan. They didn't just set a fire, they systematically doused every building with the massive stores of lamp oil they had been hoarding for months. It was not an act of vengeance. It was an act of erasure. They were wiping the slate clean, destroying the evidence, the witnesses, and the very prison they had built for themselves. Blythe's theory accounted for everything. The simultaneous fires, the unnatural heat, the missing bodies. Alara and Cyrus had not been victims of the inferno, they were its architects. While the swamp burned and the storm raged, they had simply slipped away. They would have used the chaos to take a boat, stocked with provisions, and vanish into the coastal waterways. From there, the world was open to them. New Orleans, the Caribbean, Europe. With Alara's wealth, converted to gold and jewels, and Cyrus's intellect and ruthlessness, they were a new, terrifying breed. They were not master and slave. They were partners. A union forged in sadism, psychological control, and a shared, macabre worldview. They had used the rigid, brutal system of slavery not just for exploitation, but as a crucible to create each other. Blythe was haunted by this thought. He had not been witnessing a simple case of depravity. He had been witnessing the birth of two new, perfect monsters. His journal ends with a single, trembling line. "May God have mercy on wherever they have gone, for they will have none." This brings us back to 1872. To the surveyor, Thomas Fry, standing in the ruined cellar holding the two halves of Alara's soul. The ledger filled with the cold arithmetic of her daytime sadism. The chest filled with the silks and masks of her nighttime fantasy. He had also found, tucked inside a loose brick in the chimney, the moldering remains of Reverend Blythe's journal. As he read the clergyman's terrified account, the true, horrifying story of Vance Hollow revealed itself to him. He was standing on the ruins of a kingdom built by a mad queen and her anointed king, a kingdom they had immolated to cover their escape. The official story was a lie. The slaves in the quarters had not committed mass suicide. They had been murdered. They were the final loose ends, the last witnesses, sacrificed to the flames by Alara and Cyrus to ensure their perfect, clean escape. The sheer, calculating, inhuman coldness of the act was staggering. It was the final, macabre masterpiece of a woman who turned human beings into objects, and who, in the end, had found one object she could not bear to part with. The story of Elara Vance and Cyrus is a cold case that can never be solved. It is a macabre mystery that transcends the simple brutality of the era. What truly happened in the soundproofed, forbidden wing? What began as a master's cruel exploitation, and when did it transform into something else? Was Cyrus a victim who, in the end, seized power? Or was he a willing participant from the start, a mind that recognized its own dark reflection in his mistress? Theirs was a relationship that existed in a space banned by all known laws of God and man. It was a union of absolute power and absolute submission, until the lines blurred, and it was no longer clear who was the master and who was the slave. Elara's daytime punishments, the rigid, pious order, was a desperate facade. It was the struggling grip of a woman terrified of the very chaos she was unleashing in her own home, in her own soul. She wasn't a hypocrite, leading two different lives. She was a single, horrifying entity, her sadism and her desire feeding each other, until they consumed her and everyone around her. If you find these forbidden histories compelling and want to uncover more cold cases that have been buried by time, subscribe to Macabre Mysteries of America. The truth is often far stranger and far more disturbing than any fiction. The story of Vance Hollow is a chilling reminder of the secrets that can fester in isolated places, protected by power and polite silence. Alara Vance created a fortress, not just of wood and brick, but of psychological terror. She designed a world where she was the only god, the only arbiter of pleasure and pain. She sought to remake human beings in her own dark image, to break them down to their core components and rebuild them as she saw fit. She succeeded, beyond her wildest dreams, with Cyrus. She forged a man who was her equal in cruelty, intelligence, and ambition. She had, in effect, created the instrument of her own liberation and the damnation of everyone else. The fire was not an end. It was a baptism. A new, terrifying entity was born from those flames. What became of them? Alara Vance and Cyrus vanished from history. There are no records, no sightings, no rumors. They were ghosts. But the questions linger, haunting the narrative. Did they find a new hollow in some other corner of the world? Did they continue their dreadful partnership, or did the balance of power, once free from the constraints of the plantation, finally shatter, leading one to destroy the other? It is a disturbing thought. A master and a slave, bound by a shared macabre past, set loose upon the world. The legend of Vance Hollow changed after Fry's discovery. The locals no longer spoke of a simple slave revolt. They spoke of the mistress and her shadow, a two-headed ghost that haunted the swamps. They said that on stormy nights, you could still hear the faint sound of that strange, melodic music and smell the scent of jasmine and musk on the wind. The land was cursed, not by the dead, but by the horrifying, unresolved mystery of the living. It was a place where the very laws of nature and society had been inverted, and the consequences were too terrible to be fully known. The tale of Elara Vance is a uniquely American horror story. It is a story about the absolute, corrupting nature of power and the profound, macabre depravity that can flourish in a system that defines human beings as property. Elara was a product of her time, yet she was also something entirely outside of it. She defied the conventions of her gender and her class, not for liberation, but to build a more perfect, more personal, more intimate tyranny. She didn't just want to own bodies, she wanted to own souls. She wanted to be the sole author of their reality, the giver of all pain and all pleasure. This is the ultimate forbidden power. It is the story of a sociopath given a kingdom, and in that kingdom she found a kindred spirit, a man who, instead of breaking, was reforged. The punishments by day were a test. The pleasures by night were a reward, and the fire was their graduation. Today, nothing remains of Vance Hollow. The land was eventually drained and timbered in the 20th century. The ruins were plowed under, the charred oak tree torn down. The ledger and the chest found by Thomas Fry were dismissed as curiosities and lost to history, their horrifying implications ignored. The journal of Reverend Blythe is the only record that remains, a chilling testament to a truth that was too disturbing to confront. This story confronts us with the terrifying reality of the secrets hidden behind the veil of respectability. It shows how power, isolation, and a complete lack of accountability can create a laboratory for the most forbidden forms of human depravity. Alara Vance was a monster, but she was a monster that the system allowed to exist. She was protected by her wealth, her status, and the willed ignorance of her neighbors. She built a fortress of sadism and desire, and when that fortress was threatened, she simply burned it to the ground and walked away, leaving only ashes and a legend that still chills the blood. The story of Vance Hollow is a disturbing meditation on the nature of identity. Who was Elara Vance? Was she the cold, pious mistress or the decadent queen of the forbidden wing? And who did Cyrus become? A puppet, a partner, a new, more terrifying master. The truth is that they were all of these things. Elara's great, macabre sin was not just her cruelty, but her ambition. She sought to dissolve the boundaries between master and slave, pain and pleasure, control and chaos. She wanted to merge them into a new, singular, horrifying reality with herself and her chosen partner at the center. She was an alchemist of the soul, and she was terrifyingly successful. The mystery of her escape, her vanishing, is perhaps the most unsettling part of the tale. Unlike most stories of this kind, there is no final justice. There is no retribution. The evil was not punished. It was, quite simply, released. It evolved, adapted, and moved on. The legacy of Vance Hollow is one of silence. It is a story that was banned, erased from the official histories. It exists only in the margins, in a frightened clergyman's journal, and the whispers of a cursed piece of land. It reminds us that the darkest parts of our history are not always the ones we know. They are the ones that have been systemically purged, burned away like Alara's plantation, because the truth they contain is too fundamentally disruptive, too challenging to our sense of order and justice. The tale of the mistress who punished by day and slept with her slaves by night is not just a ghost story. It is a cold case about the horrifying union of power and depravity, and the terrifying possibility that the monsters of our past did not always meet their end. Some, the most intelligent, the most ruthless, simply covered their tracks and walked away, leaving us to wonder in the dark. Alara Vance's obsession with Cyrus remains the most chilling aspect of her story. It was a macabre fascination that went beyond simple desire. In him, she saw a reflection. While her daytime world was built on the meticulous breaking of wills, her nighttime world was dedicated to the forging of one. She subjected him to the most brutal punishments, not to destroy him, but to test his limits, to burn away his weakness as a slave. When he refused to break, she saw him as a success. She then brought him into her forbidden wing, not as a slave, but as an apprentice. She educated him, clothed him, and shared with him her dark, forbidden knowledge. She was not just seeking a lover, she was creating an equal, a partner in her own image. This is the ultimate perversion of the Pygmalion myth. She was not sculpting a statue into a woman, she was forging a weapon into a man. A man who, by her own design, was as ruthless, as intelligent, and as cold as she was. Their partnership was the pinnacle of her life's work. The final act, the murder of Silas and the immolation of the plantation, was therefore not just an escape. It was a coronation. It was the moment the apprentice became the master, standing side by side with his creator. Reverend Blythe's journal speculates on this with profound terror. He wrote, "What bond is stronger than that forged in shared atrocity? They are bound not by love, but by a shared knowledge that separates them from all other living souls. They have seen the depths of each other's depravity and embraced it. They are a new two-headed serpent, and the world is their garden." This horrifying image is what separates the Vance Hollow case from any other. We are left with the chilling realization that the story did not end in the fire. The fire was the beginning. Two figures, stripped of their past identities, the mistress and the slave, walked out of those flames as something new, something free. Free from the law, free from society, and free from the very constraints of morality. The fate of the other slaves is the story's most profound tragedy. They were not just victims of Alara's cruelty or Cyrus's ambition. They were, in the end, disposable. They were the backdrop for a grand, macabre play. Their lives, their suffering, their very existence were just tools in Alara's laboratory of the soul. When the experiment was complete, the laboratory was cleansed. Their deaths in the fire were not a revolt, but a final, contemptuous act of housekeeping. They were the last witnesses to the creation of Alara and Cyrus's dark union, and like Sela's, they had to be erased. This is the horrifying calculus of the truly monstrous. Human lives are reduced to variables in a personal equation, and when the equation is solved, the variables are discarded. The smoking ruins found by the sheriff were not the site of a tragedy, but the solution to a problem. If you have been captivated by this dark journey and wish to explore more of history's most chilling cold cases, hit the like button and be sure to subscribe to Macabre Mysteries of America. We are dedicated to uncovering the forbidden stories that have been deliberately buried. The story of Vance Hollow is a prime example of a narrative that was actively suppressed. The local gentry, the sheriff, even the state, they all had an interest in accepting the slave revolt theory. It was clean. It reinforced their worldview. The alternative, that a white, aristocratic woman had willingly abandoned her race, her class, and her humanity to forge a forbidden partnership with a slave, and had murdered dozens to cover her tracks, was simply unthinkable. It was a truth so socially radioactive, so deeply unnatural to the 19th century mind, that it could not be allowed to exist. It was easier to believe in a cursed piece of land than to confront the reality of Elara Vance. The objects found by Thomas Fry in the cellar are the perfect summary of this disturbing tale. The punishment ledger represents the world of daylight, of order, of the rigid, brutal system of control that everyone knew existed. It was the acceptable face of Alara's evil, the cruelty that society was willing to tolerate. But the mahogany chest, filled with silks, masks, and perfumes, represents the true, hidden engine of her soul. It was the world of the night, of chaos, of forbidden desire, and of a power that was far more intoxicating and dangerous. The ledger was the law. The chest was the gospel. Most masters were content to rule by the ledger. Alara's dark genius was in discovering that the chest was the more powerful tool. She realized that true, absolute control did not come from the whip. It came from the terrifying, unpredictable, and absolute control over pleasure and pain, blurring the line between the two until her subjects could no longer tell them apart. Ultimately, the story of Vance Hollow leaves us with a profound and unsettling silence. The swamp reclaimed the land, the official histories erased the names, and the truth was buried in a clergyman's forgotten journal. We are left staring into the abyss that Alara Vance created. We are left to wonder what new forms of day and night she and Cyrus constructed in the free world. The case remains cold, not because of a lack of evidence, but because the crime itself is so vast, so psychologically complex, that it defies categorization. It was a story of sadism, of forbidden love, of a partnership in murder, and of a meticulously planned escape. It is the story of two people who played a long, macabre game against the world, and in the end, they won. The ruins of Vance Hollow are not a monument to a tragic fire. They are a monument to a horrifying and perfect victory.